From the Free Press, this is Honestly. Senator Paul is an anomaly right now on the American right. He's libertarian, so he's pro-free trade, free market, and anti-subsidy. He's also a deficit hawk and criticizes both Donald Trump and Joe Biden on spending. And he's one of just 7 Republican senators who still refuses to endorse Donald Trump. He says it's over this very issue, the $1.9 trillion deficit, that he thinks is the most existential issue facing America. Senator Paul believes that to lower the deficit, we need to cut military spending, cut Medicaid, cut Medicare, and cut Social Security. But neither the Republicans nor the Democrats will go anywhere near those sacred cows. All of this makes him a dying breed in a party that's all positions that are antithetical to Rand Paul's libertarian worldview.
Senator Rand Paul, welcome to Honestly.
Well, thanks for having me.
Very happy to have you. So we're about 50 days out from this election, and you, with I think 6 or 7 other Republican senators, still have not endorsed the Republican candidate, still have not endorsed Donald Trump. Why?
You know, I haven't felt the enthusiasm. I have some misgivings about some major policy. For example, I think that the deficit drives inflation, and I think that the degree of accumulation of the debt not only causes inflation, but I think threatens to have a day where the world loses confidence in buying our debt. And that could lead to a catastrophe, I think, if abruptly people quit buying our debt. I don't think the Democrats are any better. I mean, Trump accumulated about $8 trillion in debt during his term. And it's almost going to be exactly the same amount. It sort of fits my argument for saying there's a pox on both parties with regard to being fiscally responsible, that Trump will add $8 trillion and Biden and Harris will add $8 trillion also. And somebody's got to stand up and say enough's enough. But none of that is to be saying that somehow Kamala Harris is going to be fiscally more responsible. No, I think she'd be worse. I mean, the Democrats are bigger spenders than the Republicans. I just haven't been enthused enough to get out and go on the hustings and campaign for Trump. I'm also not a big fan of tariffs, frankly. I think that tariffs are simply a tax on the consumer. I think that we all grow rich through international trade. I accept the statement by Bastiat, the famous French free trader, who said, you know, when goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. I think that trade is a great deterrent to war. And these are things I disagree with Trump on. Now, is Biden and Harris any better? No, they left most of the tariffs on China. Most of the tariffs are in place that Trump put forward. And lately, you know, Trump and Vance have been beating up Biden and Harris over Nippon Steel buying U.S. steel.
Right.
And now they've got everybody, all 4 of them are saying, no, we're going to prevent this transaction from happening. And I think it's disgraceful, bad for the consumer, bad for the American taxpayer, and bad all around. And it makes me less excited, I guess, about getting out and campaigning for Donald Trump.
I think on a lot of levels, depending on the issue, many Americans feel a pox on both their houses and feel like the decision this election is a choice between the lesser of 2 evils. Do you believe that that's true? And I guess if you had to choose the lesser of 2 evils, who would that be, Trump or Kamala?
You know, I will support and vote for Trump over Harris, and mainly because I think that there is some truth to the fact that the Democrat Party is the one of Santa Claus for children, you know, dispersing gifts to children without any forethought or any consequences that might come from this idea of something for nothing. Republicans are more honest with saying we can't have something for nothing. There needs to be opportunity. We're going to offer you opportunity, the American dream, but nothing really concrete. We're not going to give you $25,000 to buy a house because we don't have it. The problem with Republicans is they honestly will say the debt is a problem, but they really don't do anything about it. And they take entitlements off the table. They won't reform entitlements. But Democrats aren't any better. If anything, Democrats spend more money or less concerned about the debt. For someone who's concerned about the debt, the Republican Party is the better party, frankly. It doesn't mean they're good at it, but they're better. I'll tell you, though, I had an interesting conversation about a month or 2 ago with the ambassador from Sweden. And, you know, some of his titles are head of the Youth Socialist League. He's a social democrat, all this stuff. And I sit down and talk to him. And after about 5 minutes, I said, you're more fiscally conservative than all the Democrats in town and half of the Republicans. And it's interesting. they're very much into sort of this egalitarianism and taxes and spread the wealth around through welfare, but they're very fiscally conservative when it comes to the budget. They balance their budget in Sweden. Well, they do it through high taxes, but they also like the age of longevity, when for all their pension plans, if the age of longevity is going up, it's indexed to that, and the age goes up, and there's no debate about it because they know they can't borrow for their old age pension program. And yet, if you bring that up in Washington, everybody runs away frightened, with their hair on fire. Democrats won't even consider talking about reforming the pension, and Republicans know they need to, but are afraid to talk about it.
When did the Republicans lose the plot on the deficit? Why are you one of the only people talking about small government and, less spending and balancing the budget, which is meant to be the Republicans' core issue? Like, what's the origin of that betrayal?
Well, it's a big party. I mean, I would say I'm not, because every vote I've taken is for less spending and for smaller government, for less power centralized in the presidency, for more dispersal and checks and balances. So there are members of the Republican Party who do that. We're in the minority. I mean, on a good day, there's maybe 5 of us out of 50 in the U.S. Senate on the Republican side. But frankly, there's 0 on the Democrat side. Now, there are occasionally things that cross over, and I think Democrats are conscious of and do the right thing. I work with Ron Wyden on things like civil liberties. So there are people on the left like Ron Wyden who are progressive, but he and I see eye to eye, and we have a dozen bills together protecting the Fourth Amendment. Trying to keep the government out of your computer, your house, your cell phone, all of these things that should be protected privacy. Ron Wyden's great, and we work together on issues of war. I'm not much for war. I think you go to war as a last resort when attacked, and, we shouldn't be in these wars all over the place. There used to be more people on the left that were of that belief. There aren't many left, really. The progressive left has been depleted of the anti-war folks. They were in the 60s, the anti-war movement was the left. We're the Democrats. There were no Republicans. Now there's a handful of Republicans, but almost no Democrats on these issues. So there's some disappointment on that as far as degrees of war. On crony capitalism and criticism of that, there's sometimes overlap between Bernie Sanders and I. We can be on the same side of an issue sometimes with that. I think Robert Kennedy's been great on the crony capitalism of big pharma, basically. And you're seeing some more of that. But I think as far as the future of the Republican Party, there's going to be a big battle between the nationalist, populist, and those who are more the free market, free traders like myself. And that's the conflict of the future, is who's going to capture and have the direction of the party. Which way are we going to go?
Well, let's talk a little bit about military spending, since you brought it up, and really just the expansion of the military-industrial complex. That is sort of a sacred cow, I would say, for the GOP, but it isn't for you. You've argued that America should be spending radically less on defense in order to address the debt ceiling and balance the budget. Now, the argument that the people on the other side make is that the U.S. needs to be the world's policeman, and in order to do that, we may even need to spend more to play that role in the world. What do you say to that argument? Because I want to note here that while you've withheld your endorsement of Donald Trump, you gave your full-throated anti-endorsement of Nikki Haley, arguably on the grounds that she's exactly the thing that you sort of oppose within your own party. So
yeah, I'll probably stick with that. I would say that when you look at, in order to know whether we spend too much or too little on military, you can kind of compare us to other countries. So we spend more on our military than the next 10 countries combined. So for all the fear of China, I think we spend 3 times what China spends on their military. And so I think we spend more than enough, more than the next 10 countries combined. We also are in a lot of places I wouldn't necessarily be. Like, when we had 4 soldiers die in Mali a few years ago, some of the Republicans, let's say Lindsey Graham, for example, were saying, I didn't even know we were in Mali. And he's, a high-ranking person on the defense committees. But there's no reason to be in Mali or Niger. We actually trained the guy in Niger to be a promoter of democracy. He went home and he overthrew the president and became the dictator of Niger and kicked all of us out after we spent $100 million on a military base there. So I think we spend too much. But the origin of the debt in our country and the origin of the deficit, and the reason why it's both parties, is this. People outside of government and the media say the problem is we don't have enough compromise. It's actually the opposite. We have too much compromise. The compromise is always this. The right says we need more military money. The left wants more welfare money. And they compromise. And the only way you can get it is they both get what they want. And I think we need the reverse compromise. We need to say we're bankrupt. We're $2 trillion in the hole this year. We spend $1 gazillion on the military. We have 52 programs for housing, 82 programs for this. But, we have so many duplicative programs on the welfare side that if you came in and radically consolidated it, made them more efficient and made less of them, you could probably do more than you're doing now with less money. But basically the compromise would be military's got to come down a little bit, and so does welfare and the entitlements as well. So if you put them all together, we're not talking about radically cutting government. We're just talking about taking a small sliver of everything. And I think you could do it without reducing benefits necessarily. I think there's enough waste and inefficiency in government that if you're talking about reducing something by 1%, I think it could be done really without harming the programs or even the mission of the programs.
Because you brought up Lindsey Graham, I need to ask something that he said of you a few years back. He said, when it comes to fighting radical Islam and bad actors, Senator Paul is constantly AWOL. He added, there's no threat to America that Senator Rand Paul will not retreat from, and his approach to protecting America and foreign policy is one step behind leading from behind. What do you say to that?
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. We've had words back and forth. I think I've accused him of being the least informed on the Bill of Rights of any senator up here, and the least likely to defend the Bill of Rights as well. No, he is the best example I can think of sort of the neoconservative or the one who believes that we should be the world's policeman. I don't think he has a mature understanding of war or the ramifications of war. He's served in the military forever. He's like in the legal part of the military. But at the same time, I don't think he has a sufficient understanding, and he sees things different than me. When I see, we have a young man in our town who lost both legs and an arm, it grieves me, that of the war that he was in, and I have every hope in my body that it doesn't happen to someone else. And I don't think he sees things the same as far as trying to prevent war. I also don't see things in stark black and white terms, that there's good and evil everywhere, and we can always determine good from evil. I think in a lot of the wars, it's a mixed bag, and there's some good people on one side, some good people on the other, and it isn't exactly this stark, which is the one. Think about it, the money we spent through decades with Mugabe in Zimbabwe. The guy was a tyrant. He tortured and killed his own people. He wasn't in any way a Democrat as far as being for democracy, and yet we gave him billions of dollars. We've gotten involved with wars many times when it's sort of unclear who are the worst people involved, particularly during the Cold War. If you were anti-Soviet Union, we were for you, no matter what you were doing to your people. But Lindsey Graham, I think, is an example of someone who I don't think has a sufficient regard for the effects of war.
Well, certain things, maybe you don't think this. I would argue that certain things are binary. I look at the war between Israel and Hamas, and I wonder if you see that as a war of good versus evil.
I think it certainly is a binary thing if you live there. If that was your family that died on October 7th, without question, it's a binary thing. And it becomes binary in the sense that, yes, there's good and evil, and the people who did that were evil, and they deserve to be eradicated. Where it becomes messier is after a while. And so, and I've tried to stay out of telling them what to do. My answer to not telling Israel what to do is, we don't have the money, we shouldn't be giving. We just gave another $26 billion to Israel. I would not tell Israel what to do, but I wouldn't have borrowed $26 billion to give it to them. And I'm all for them to defeat Hamas. But there does become a point. This battle's been raging in Gaza. And I'm not here to say that it should have stopped or they have to accept a ceasefire. But I would say that there is a point at which there is enough collateral damage that for every terrorist you kill, if there's 5 or 6 collateral damage, is there enough terrorists that are created by the next generation of people who were related to the people who are the collateral damage that it becomes something that isn't actually a net gain, that the war goes on forever? And this isn't to say they can't defend themselves. Of course they should. But I'll give you an example of how I think there are alternative futures and alternative possibilities. I was there in 2013, and I met with Netanyahu. And as I traveled around, I didn't go into Gaza because Hamas was in charge and it wasn't advisable. I did go into the West Bank. I traveled around Israel. I met with Israeli politicians. I met with Arabs. I went to Jordan. And I guess I came across with all of them believing there was no grand peace plan that was going to happen anytime soon, but they were open and hoping for incrementalism. So the one thing I mentioned to Netanyahu was I said, why don't you have allow them to develop a port in Gaza? So why don't you do a port kind of like the Panama Canal, where the security would be joint security for the next 50 years or 99 years between Israeli soldiers and whoever's in Gaza. Now, that's easier said than done, too, because Hamas, they didn't want to negotiate with Hamas, and Hamas is terrible. But it is something that would be a goal to have Gaza actually become a port, get support from surrounding Arab nations, and try to find out, are there any civilized people that are not Hamas? Is there a chamber of commerce for Gaza, people who own businesses that you could actually negotiate with? And the reason I guess I hold out hope for something like that is the answer isn't going to be just, Gaza is destroyed, and I don't fault Israel for it, but at the same time, I don't think it's ultimately going to be the answer. I think what's going to come out of it is the chaos that will lead to the next crisis 5 years from now or 10 years from now.
Well, America and other nations have given Gaza hundreds of millions of dollars to build it up, and unfortunately, Hamas rules it and decided to build tunnels. I just want to ask you one question, though, about Israel and aid to Israel, because I think you have a really interesting position. The U.S. provides around $3 billion in military aid to Israel each year, and you have argued that the U.S. should phase this out. By the way, there's a lot of very pro-Israel people I know who make a similar argument. Explain why you believe that that's the best thing for America, and arguably, some would say, a good thing for Israel, too.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with sympathy or opposition to Israel. It has to do with what is in the best interest of our national security and our national defense. And I think the best thing that the biggest problem or the biggest thing that we face in the future is the debt. And so even though I'm pro-Israel and I think what Hamas has done is horrible and I want Israel to win the war, it doesn't mean I think it's a good idea to borrow money from China to send it to Israel. We have no rainy day fund. We have no extra money sitting around. Now, if you came to me and said, we spend $850 billion on the military, and I want to give $30 billion of that to Israel, and I'm willing to cut $30 billion from the military in order to do that, because I think Israel's part of our first line of defense in the Middle East, that's at least a more valid argument. But if you come to me and say, we're just going to add it onto the tab, $30 billion in addition, but I also think self-sufficiency is good. Israel's a very rich country. The average per capita income there rivals the West, rivals the U.S. They've got great technology. They're succeeding at a lot of things there. And it doesn't mean they have to be left alone. But Netanyahu said back in '96 that he was in favor of gradually weaning themselves off of this aid. Some argue that Israel's defense becomes stronger the more they spend it on manufacturers that they produce. They produce quite a bit, but when we give them $1, we insist that 70% of it be spent with our defense manufacturers. So I met people when I was in Israel actually were advocating for less aid because they thought it would make their defense industry stronger.
Totally.
Be making more of their stuff at home.
You've said in the past that you're not an isolationist. You're also not an interventionist. There's certain people, I would say, sort of broadly on the center right, who believe that America is now being challenged in a way that we maybe have not been since the end of the Cold War, maybe even going back to World War II. And we need to do everything in our power to remain the world's hegemon, to remain the only superpower in the world. And there are other people on the right who say, sorry, guys, it's already too late. The multipolar world is here. And the best thing we can do is learn how to protect our own interests in that context. Which one do you broadly fall into?
I think the most accurate and biggest threat of isolationism is trade isolationism. These are the people who want to have an embargo on China and have no trade with China. They want no trade with Russia. They want no trade with Iran. They want no trade with North Korea. That's an isolationism. If you look back historically at precipitating causes of war, typically the end of trade is a problem. People point towards, and you can't say one thing caused war, but, before the beginning of hostilities with Japan, before the attack on Pearl Harbor, there's about a 6-month to a year time of an embargo of Japan where we were not letting any oil or gas go in, and they're completely dependent on imports. So when you begin embargoing and forbidding trade, that escalates things, and that kind of isolationism is bad. So I'm not a trade isolationist. I'm actually a big believer in international trade and believe that it's an impediment to war.
So
I am against giving money to people that we don't have. So we run a deficit. So I'm against giving money to Mother Teresa. I mean, appreciate to people. I think she was a great person, actually. But I mean, the thing is we don't have any money, and you can't just borrow money, and it's bad for a country and makes us weaker. But I think being fiscally responsible with money, if we define that as being isolationism, I think we've done a disservice, to the accuracy of the term. And most people use it as an epithet. It is meant to be derogatory, and of course, I don't accept the term. But when people call me that, I know that they are an enemy, and they are trying to deride what I believe in. I believe in fiscal responsibility, which means you can't give away money you don't have. So I'll give you an example. What Saudi Arabia did to the journalist Khashoggi, I thought was outrageous, and there should have been more of a response from the United States. And what I would have done is I would have quit selling arms. And I've had several votes where I've forced votes in the Senate. I've lost, unfortunately, but I've forced votes in the Senate to say no more arms for Saudi Arabia. But if you ask me, should we cut off trade with Saudi Arabia? I would say no. So it's a bad thing that they did. It means they have to go a long way to prove to me they want to be part of the civilized world. But at the same time, I'm not willing to have a war with them over it or forbid trade with Saudi Arabia. Same goes with China. I've written 2 books, The Case Against Socialism and Deception, the Great COVID Cover-Up. Both are very critical of the Chinese Communist government. One for socialism and the famines under Mao, but then 2 over the cover-up of the lab leak of COVID. But at the same time, I'm probably one of the biggest advocates for not ending trade with China, because I think it's going to lead to a worsening world conflict.
Why do you think protectionism on the left and the right is so in vogue right now? I mean, just today, Trump said that if he wins, he'll tax Mexican auto imports by 200%. That's one of a dozen examples I could pick. But there's other things on the other side. What is it about this political moment, if you could pop up to like 10,000 feet, that explains why this is good politics, if not good policy?
I think it's economic ignorance. So I think people don't understand that international trade makes us richer. When you look at specifically just trade with China over the last 20 years, the average American is $1,500 richer because Chinese products have saved them $1,500 annually. If you look at international trade with all countries that we trade with, it's about $7,000 of improved purchasing power or wealth to every American citizen. Well, we don't say that enough. People think, we'll just put tariffs on, it won't be a big deal, we'll bring in all this revenue. But tariffs get responded to. When you look at the Great Depression, the hot smoothie tariff was responded to, and we had a worldwide back and forth on tariffs. And many people point to that tariff as extending. You had the initial crash in 29. There was actually a little sputtering. Some people thought there might be an improvement, and it gets worse through 1937. And some people believe that was the interruption of international trade. So I think economic ignorance leads to this, but it's also, Bastiat talked about this, the seen and the unseen. If you have a steel company that makes steel in the U.S., and I put a big tariff on Chinese steel, I can go to you, I can go to all your workers, I can see your shiny plant, and you can tell me all the profit you make, and all your workers are beaming and looking and saying, what a great person I am for putting tariffs on it. What I can't see is all the people who buy steel. And there's a lot of them, but there are many more, but they're not all in one place. They can be builders of commercial buildings, residential buildings, fencing, you name it, who have to buy steel. When the price goes up for that, and then all the consumers pay more, it's one individual at a time. So if 1 million consumers pay $1 more, it's harder to see that. But I can see $1 million that I give to a steel manufacturer by protecting that person's company. So it's the seen. It's easy to see the things you protect. It's harder to see the distributed person who is losing out on these tariffs. But the bottom line is the evidence is incredibly strong that trade makes us richer. And the best way to look at this is when we went from sort of a tribal society to the beginning and advent of capitalism, around when Adam Smith talked about it, 1776 and beyond, Industrial Revolution, we had the division of labor. And so you lived in a village, you made your clothes, you made your socks, you did everything, you made your shoes. Well, then we had the division of labor, and somebody in the village made the shoes, and that's all they did. And the shoes became more efficient and cheaper, and you were richer because you didn't have to make your own shoes. But then we traded with the next village over, and you became even richer because they specialized even more. And then you spread the trade not only among cities to states to international. It's that spread of the division of labor that makes us all so much richer, and it's incalculably richer. I mean, it is a huge engine of our prosperity has been trade, but it's easy to demagogue, and it's easy to take the other side and say, oh, I'm going to protect America. I'm going to protect American steelmakers.
We're in a moment that is both protectionist, sort of from both directions, and also populist. And I think a lot about our populist moment and the dangers of it. And I think one of the dangers of this moment is the voices that claim to speak on behalf of the people are often the voices that are most extreme or don't represent the wisdom of the crowd, but sort of represent the madness of the crowds. And there's a lot of that, frankly, coming from inside the Libertarian Party. And I want to just name a few things. This week, the official Twitter account from the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire, run by a guy called Jeremy Kauffman, tweeted, "Anyone who murders Kamala Harris would be an American hero." When Nina Turner, Democrat affiliated with Bernie Sanders, tweeted insulin should be free, he tweeted picking crops should be free. And on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, the account tweeted, "America isn't in debt to Black people. If anything, it's the other way around." And there's lots of examples of this nature that are sort of becoming more normalized in our politics, whether it's Candace Owens, used to identify as libertarian, sort of losing her mind, or Tucker Carlson having on this revisionist historian, Daryl Cooper. What do you make of the sort of movement in this populist moment of things that used to be consigned to the lunatic fringe, or at least sort of were shamed in the mainstream, to the center of our politics?
You know, I think that the danger of populism and nationalism, I think they're variants of the same thing, is they're not guided necessarily by a guiding principle. They're guided by getting to a certain result. So to me, it makes a difference what the result. I want our country to be rich, but if we could be rich by having plunder and war like the Vikings and going and taking everybody's stuff, I wouldn't be for that. But if you talk about sort of a libertarian principle, or a principle that motivates people who believe in limited government, you know, my father, I think, put it very well. He had a farewell speech in 1984 where he wrote that many people will come and go from Congress, and like many, I may be forgotten. But I came here for a different purpose, not to accumulate power, but to dissipate power. And the idea is that there's a central focus that, to me, it isn't about one particular issue, but it's about the idea that power over another individual should be very, very minimal, that government should be as small as it can possibly be, that government's a necessary evil, that in order to have government, they've got to take some of my liberty, and I want to give as little as possible. And that drives everything that I'm sort of for. And so when you ask me about tariffs, I think there's an economic argument against tariffs, but I think there's also a strong liberty argument against letting one person have tariffs. So I've just introduced legislation to take that power from the presidency and make sure that if there are going to be tariffs, they still will be economically bad, but they're going to have to pass Congress if my bill were to pass. And so to me, that's an issue of power as opposed to just the issue of tariffs. It's an issue of how power should be distributed. So I'm a big believer that the presidents have too much power. I also passed a bill in my committee today that I hope will become law that limits national emergency powers for presidents. Right now, a president can issue an emergency and it goes on forever. It's supposed to be reviewed at a year, but we would have to have a 2/3 vote to get rid of the emergency. We're going to turn it on its head. Presidents will still be allowed to say there's an emergency, but after 30 days, it has to affirmatively be voted on by Congress or it's gone. This will get rid of a lot of emergencies and put the power back into Congress. There's also something that people have begun talking about called the internet kill switch. In the 1930s, they passed a law, an FCC law, that says that all electronic communications can be stopped by a president during an emergency. It's never been used. I think people have hinted around at it. FDR might have hinted around at it at one time, but it's still on the books, and people fear that a rogue president can use that power. And I don't care who the president is. I don't care if they're Republican or Democrat. But I've also have, as part of my emergency powers reform, we get rid of the internet kill switch. We get rid of the legislation. It would no longer exist that a president could shut down all communications. And so these are the way I look at issues, more of the principle of checks and balances of power, dissipating power, never letting too much power accumulate in one individual, but also there shouldn't be too much power in Washington. It should be dissipated among the states and among the cities and localities. Populists and nationalists, I don't think, look at the issue that way. I think they say, this looks good, we're going to do this. And, this is pro-America, and we're going to do it. And if the means of doing it aren't too important to them, if we got to break a few heads, to get there, it's justified because the means justify the end. But I think those of us who are more liberty-oriented are very concerned about the means that they not abrogate individual liberty.
On July 13th, Donald Trump, after he was shot at in Butler, Pennsylvania, looked like he might win all 50 states. Now it looks like Kamala Harris is going to win. You have the spectacle of Laura Loomer, who called 9/11 an inside job and tweeting about how the White House is going to smell like curry on Trump's plane. You have the former president and J.D. Vance talking about people in Springfield, Ohio, eating cats and dogs. Like, assess their campaign for me as a politician, putting policies, which we've been talking about, to the side. How did they so lose the plot?
I think you're right. When it was Biden versus Trump, all the polls were showing Trump winning the battleground states, and he was going to win. I really thought I'd never seen anything like it. I didn't think there would be a switch in candidates. I thought almost to the very end, and then all of a sudden the consensus was there. Biden couldn't win. The debate cemented it for everybody. They switched, and I agree with you. She's got an enormous bump. If you count it starting where Biden was, she's had an enormous 3 or 4 point bump. I still think it's pretty even and could go either way. I agree with you. The last week or two since this most recent debate and Springfield, Ohio discussion has made it, it's harder. They're not doing that well. And there are policy things they could talk about in the debate. I still think the most important thing that people know and you can't disabuse them of is that stuff costs more. I mean, I go to the grocery store, I see how much steak costs, we'll go to the grocery store and we're not poor, but we'll go and wait another day and see what the steak looks like the next day. It's
but
amazing.
Senator Paul, why aren't they talking about that? Why are they talking about eating cats?
They haven't asked me for advice, but if I give them advice, I'd be talking about inflation, the cost of doing things. And I would also talk about some of our proposals that are incredibly dangerous. Taxing unrealized gains in the stock market could cause a calamity worse than 1929. And I think there's a lot of evidence that's a really bad idea. Giving people $25,000 that will have to borrow, I think is a really bad idea. Will elevate the prices of homes, but also get people into homes that may not be able to make monthly payments. And we wind up with 2007, 2008 again, with all these folks overextended in houses and unable to make payments. So there's a lot to argue on policy, but they've got to get away from that. But it's very difficult for Donald Trump to get away from policy and personality. And I don't think they've been doing very well in the last couple of weeks, but I don't think it's over. I think it's still dead even.
Okay, 60 seconds for a lightning round. Elon Musk, force for good or force for ill overall?
Absolutely a force for good and a champion of free speech.
What about Kentucky produces libertarian voices like you and Thomas Massey? What's going on in Kentucky?
It's the bourbon.
Most compelling up-and-coming politician or voice on the right?
That's a good question. Massey's the most libertarian in the House, and I don't know if I have another name for you. We try to help people all the time. We weren't that successful this time around, but I tried to help 5 or 10 people, and so far I think I'm over 5 or 10 in this last election cycle. We look for libertarian voices to help.
Who's your libertarian hero?
Say again?
Who's your libertarian hero?
Well, my dad, of course.
Most compelling voice on the political left right now, politician or otherwise?
Oh, Bari Weiss, of course. No, I think Bari Weiss, you would be up there, but Glenn Greenwald, I would say. I don't know if you call Matt Taibbi from the left, but I think he would have said he's always sort of voted Democrat. I think there are a lot of voices like that to me are interesting, and always there's been this intersection between right and left on civil liberties, and I think that's what brings us together, maybe on war. I don't know your opinion on a host of issues. I just was told by my wife I had to go on your program because she's a big fan of yours.
Oh my gosh.
So.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. One word for the following. J.D. Vance is?
A nationalist.
Tim Walz is?
A socialist.
Hillary Clinton is?
Unhappy.
RFK Jr.
Insightful.
Donald Trump Jr.
Wild man.
Biggest lesson you learned from your father?
To be well-read and informed.
And last, there's a lot of doom and gloom, I would say, especially on the political right now. Do you feel pessimistic or hopeful for America's future?
Sometimes in the short term, pessimistic about policy and going the wrong direction. But overall, hugely optimistic. There's never been a better time to be alive. I tell people this all the time. I tell students all the time, never been a better time to be alive. Less racism, less bigotry, less obstacles to whoever you are to succeeding in life. And I'm a big fan of humanprogress.org. This is a offshoot of Cato. Martin Tupy does this. And looking at the statistics, in 1820, 98% of people lived on $2 a day. Everybody did. The only people that ate food were kings and queens. Everybody was poor. Fast forward to today, it was 98% of people on $2 a day. It's less than 10% of the world, the entire world. We're including Bangladesh, India, Sub-Saharan Africa. Less than 10% of the world lives on $2 a day. That is a miracle, and that's the miracle of capitalism and free trade. And I say it in almost every speech. That is the optimism. Think about it. If you finish school or if you don't finish school, there are jobs everywhere. There's so many people who don't want to work, which is bad news. But the good news is if you will work, if you will show up, if you, are a plumber, a welder, electrician, or you're a physicist, you show up for work, there are jobs everywhere for you. And I promise you, you will succeed. And you can succeed, Elon Musk, what was he? He was cleaning out tanks, when he first got here, to Canada and became the richest man in the world because he was smart, aggressive, maybe some lucky too, but it's a combination of all those. But I guarantee he doesn't sleep all day. My guess is he works, 15 hours a day.
Senator Paul, thank you so much for coming on. Honestly, we appreciate it. Thank your wife for me.